good night, good late night, early morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Today, we're going to talk about caloric restriction versus intermittent fasting. As we head into those holidays and have to worry about eating too much, just think about it. We'll talk about some of what goes on metabolically. But yep, this is the time when you can really make a difference in terms of your diet, your metabolism. Go ahead, enjoy it, celebrate, have some feasting, but think about getting some hours between the time that you eat. And certainly don't just go snacking all day long, day after day. There's some things that you can do. And if you can get over this hump in terms of your diet, then head into January. You're much, much better off. So as you may, if you haven't seen us before, we're a channel that looks at helping people prevent the most likely causes of death and disability. They all boil down, whether it's heart attack, stroke, blindness, erectile dysfunction, dementia, it all boils down to one thing: cardiovascular inflammation. Now, cardiovascular inflammation has a big set of metabolic issues. We'll talk about that. And in fact, one of the key things we'll talk about today, if you've ever heard the term fat adapted, you think, well, I'm fat adapted. We're going to go deep into the biochemistry of fat adaptation. And that's a very, very important thing for most of us, because for most of us, about 85% of, quote, normal aging and the heart attacks and strokes and dementia that go along with it really boil down to insulin resistance, prediabetes, and the risk associated with that. The vast majority of that risk can be taken off the table. And you just have to understand a little bit more about what's going on metabolically. By far, the most important thing is lifestyle. And by far, the most important component of lifestyle is what you eat, how much you eat, when you eat. And again, back to today's feature, we're going to be comparing how much you eat, what you eat, and the timing of eating. It's interesting that caloric restriction and intermittent fasting have a lot of things in common. They also have a lot of things in common with fat adaptation. Now, how can that be? Well, think about it. If you don't eat for more than 12, especially 16 hours, you're not living off of liver carbs anymore. Your liver takes in carbs, it stores it, and then it releases it with glycogen. It's called a process called glycolysis, but that only lasts for about half a day. After that, you're starting to burn fat again. So that's why fat adaptation and intermittent fasting can actually metabolically start to look very, very similar. So again, if you haven't seen this channel before, here's some of the topics we've covered recently. Changing paradigms in healthcare. One of the things that we're doing is looking deeper at, we can't provide healthcare for everybody. So one of the things we've started doing over the past year, we developed our own group of doctors, a network of doctors in Alabama. It was a very successful program in terms of teaching docs how to actually practice medicine by having an impact on patients' health, fee for value, as opposed to practicing medicine by saying, okay, I wrote this script, so therefore some insurance company needs to pay me a few bucks for writing a script. That's not the way medicine is going. It's not the way medicine should be. It is the way medicine has been for the past at least 6 decades, but it's changing rapidly. And that's a good thing for patients. It can be a good thing for docs, but docs need to retread. Docs need to learn how to do this, how to have an impact on patients' health, as opposed to having just an impact on a service so you can write a bill. Supplements are always very popular with our audience, and sometimes supplements help, sometimes they don't, sometimes they do a little of both, helping and can have some safety problems. We talked about red yeast rice recently. Labs is a big deal. You know, you hear the term over and over again. Test, don't guess. Well, that's important. One of the things that we have done, most of us, is that we've gone at least 6 years or 6 decades without having a speedometer. In other words, not knowing what our metabolism is doing, and therefore not knowing that what's happening now in our middle ages is that we're losing the ability to safely metabolize carbs. So labs are very important in the workup of understanding our metabolism. Unfortunately, labs label their normals just by statistics. So once you get over age 60, if most people have insulin resistance, your lab's likely to say normal when you have, yes, a normal level of insulin resistance, and therefore should be watching your carbs. So we go into detail on that. That one got a little bit, like most of ours, it's mostly for 8th grade level understanding, but it gets a little bit more technical in pieces. So you have to have some patience and the ability to skip over the technical stuff unless you understand it. And we've got a lot of people that do. We've got a lot of docs, a lot of healthcare people that follow the channel, and a lot of biological scientists as well. So here's the thing. The whole purpose for our channel, again, is to help people understand what is currently not understood in our healthcare systems. The U.S., which is often credited as having the best healthcare systems in the world, really doesn't have the best outcomes. Why? Well, one of the reasons, as we mentioned earlier, is that docs are paid to write scripts instead of paid to have an impact on patients' health. Another just very basic issue is that this thing, insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes, is not really well understood, well recognized. As a population, we're sort of like frogs boiling slowly. We don't understand the level of problems that our populations have with carbs. Therefore, you look at groups like Mayo, like Harvard, they've created significant evidence demonstrating that two-thirds of primary care doctors, I'm not talking about orthopedists, I'm not talking about surgeons, I'm talking about primary care doctors. Two-thirds of them do not know how to diagnose prediabetes, let alone manage it. So guess what? You're in a buyer beware perspective if you're a patient expecting your doctor to understand prediabetes, how to diagnose it, how to manage it. Your probability is only 30% that you're going to get a proper diagnosis, let alone proper management. So you have to learn some stuff on your own. And that's what this core set of courses is, core curriculum for this class. Plaque, how do you evaluate plaque? And no, it's not with a stress test. How do you evaluate insulin resistance? It's really clear how to do it. Again, a lot of docs used to know how to do it and have forgotten. And then cardiovascular inflammation, which is the real driver of heart attacks and strokes, not so much plaque. So with just a few bucks, again, we offer this for free a lot. I know that some patients call in and they say, hey, I heard the doc say that I could get this for free. Yes, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, give us a $19 contribution to help us get this information out to the rest of the world, and it's having an impact. So help us out there. If you're not a YouTuber, we have information on locals. We have some information that we provide only on locals. We've got some very loyal locals members on Rumble as well. And if you are a YouTuber, join us. Join the group, and again, help us get that information out there. The monthly subscription plans have become the most popular way of getting our services. Michelle can help you if you have questions. And I'm going to skip over the book and the Medicare chronic care management program today. I'm going to just briefly mention the Prevention Network. We're continuing to do more work on the Doctors Prevention Network. We've developed a channel. We should start getting the videos up today. We've got a couple of dozen videos which help doctors understand what is value-based care, how do you prevent disease in your patient population, and how can you get into the 21st century in terms of medicine. If I've heard it once, I've heard 1,000 complaints about my doctor doesn't know how to do this. Well, again, we're helping your doc do that. So find this information, go to our links, and refer your doctor to it. Believe it or not, your doctor can make more money, get home at night, and do much better for your care by preventing it, as opposed to just that staying on that treadmill and putting you on that treadmill of fee for service. Ozempic shortage. Yes, there's a significant shortage of Ozempic. You know, again, it's how a weight loss. There was an article recently, and I thought it really spoke a lot to the problem. It's how a weight loss fad slashed access to a diabetes drug. It's a diabetes drug, and I've got a lot of diabetics that need it for that reason, but it's also a weight loss fad. And so the manufacturer, it's the one with the calf. I can't remember the name of it right now, but they've lost the ability to keep up with demand. There's a shortage of Ozempic nationwide and even in Canadian pharmacies. A lot of pharmacy prescriptions are just not being filled. Alternatives include Trulicity, dulaglutide, and Victoza or liraglutide. So what's happening is we will ask the patient, will you call your pharmacist to ask them what they have available? And the pharmacist often responds, well, here, write the prescription and I'll tell you whether we have it. Well, you know, that's not working. I can't tell you the number of Ozempic prescriptions we've written just for the pharmacist to say, okay, well, we don't have that. Well, it's like, that's why we asked you in the beginning, in the first place, what do you have? We are providing prescriptions to our current patients who need it and ask the pharmacist to give an indication of whether or not it's going to be filled. We're not providing prescriptions for Byetta, exenatide. It's had some linkage with endocrine disorders. Other options, we called a pharmacy recently, locally, and here's what she gave us. She was with a large chain, Kroger, I think, and she said there's a lot of Trulicity, 0.75 milligrams weekly available. Wegovy, 1.7 milligrams to 2.4 milligrams weekly. Mounjaro, 2.5 to 7.5 weekly. And Januvia and Rybelsus. So again, there are options out there. Or like many of us, you may just say, look, I'm going to wait until next year and wait for Ozempic. Now, obesity and type 2 diabetes in children. This was an interesting article because one of the things that it showed is that it's not just an obesity problem. We have said multiple times, well, with the obesity epidemic, diabetes is now becoming an issue for adolescents and even children. This was a systematic review, a meta-analysis in JAMA Network, the JAMA Open Network. And what they found was, again, significant problems with thin people, especially among girls, having risk for type 2 diabetes, even without obesity. This is part of this continuing process where, as we're getting better and better awareness of the problem, we're doing more and more testing, and we're finding more and more problems. So some details on it. It was a meta-analysis. It included 53 articles, 8,942 pediatric patients. The overall obesity prevalence among the diabetic patients was 75%. So again, 1/4 of these kids were not obese. The prevalence of obesity at the time of diagnosis was 77%. Males had a higher odds of obesity. Asians had the lowest. White participants had higher prevalence of obesity. Skinny people, teens, especially girls, had a risk of type 2 diabetes without obesity. I guess the skinny people, sort of obvious. And obviously, genetics is playing a role here. One of the questions that we have, especially with this gender disparity, is how much of this is a muscle and exercise thing? We do know that regular use of large muscle groups in our body provides an escape hatch. It bypasses ailing insulin receptors. But again, we have it's going to take more time, more digging to find out exactly what's going on there. So if you'll give us the water ball, we'll get into today's content. So, as we said, or as I said earlier, there's a significant overlap between becoming fat adapted and different types of fasting, including intermittent fasting. And why is that? Again, because once you get beyond the liver's storage of glycogen, you're outside of the carb metabolism and you're into burning fat. So whether you're burning fat from your diet, if you're on a keto diet, you never get into the carb burning mode anyway. So you get fat adapted that way. And people talk about getting the keto flu when they start going into a keto diet. What's going on there? Well, it's a significant change in metabolism, just like the flu. Except the flu, well, maybe not just like the flu. The flu is changing your metabolism, slowing you down, making you tired, increasing your temperature to have an impact for your immune system. With the keto flu, you've got a major change in your fuel. So you're built to burn carbs, and then all of a sudden you don't have carbs to burn. The proteins that burn carbs are very, very different from the proteins that burn fat in our metabolism. And again, we're going to go over some of that over the next few slides as we talk about intermittent fasting and impact on health, aging, and disease. This is a review of a review article. I covered this back a couple of years ago. The day after Christmas, that in 2019, this was published in the New England Journal. And prior to that, intermittent fasting was something that people tended to see in terms of, internet docs on the media, but there really was very little academic understanding or appreciation. This article put this on the roadmap for the academic centers. So, and it does a good job of talking about the changes in metabolism associated with intermittent fasting. So let's go into the content here. IF, or intermittent fasting, used to be internet doc stuff. Then a couple of years ago, it started appearing in the New England Journal. It appeared the day after Christmas in 2019, and I did a video on it. The study wasn't so much a study as a combination of science review, editorial, and a call to action for academic centers to recognize the importance and validity of intermittent fasting. It went into detail on metabolic impact, talking about bioindicators and other evidence of metabolic value. It reinterpreted previous caloric restriction studies, indicated that many actually contained intermittent fasting incorrectly labeled as caloric restriction. Now, how did that happen? That was a simple and interesting concept. Once you begin to go back and look at it, it's like, oh. So many of these studies on caloric restriction were done with laboratory models, lab rats. What they would do is they would feed the lab rats once a day, and they assumed that was intermittent. They assumed it was caloric restriction. But what they didn't understand was since they were feeding them once a day, they didn't think about this. The rats ate all the food when it was given to them. If they didn't, their competitors in the cage would eat it. So they were only eating once a day. Now, let's go into a little bit more detail on the metabolism. Oh gosh, I had this set up. Hold on, give me just a second. Okay, so in this slide, you have, it's the cellular response to energy restriction that integrates the cycles of feeding and fasting with metabolism. Total energy intake, diet composition, and length of fasting between meals contributes to oscillations in the ratios of the levels of bioenergetic sensors, NAD. In other words, this is another way of saying what I said a minute ago. Once you start getting into a fasting mode, you're in fat burn mode. Now, I mentioned that we were going to go into some of the biochemistry. Here it comes. NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, changing to NADH. That bond, the NAD to NADH, that bond holds energy. ATP to AMP, that's adenosine triphosphate to adenosine monophosphate. Each of those adenosine and phosphate bonds holds energy. And again, what's happening in the fasting mode? AMP, NAD, and in the next one, acetyl-CoA to CoA, the CoA method. In other words, all of these lower energy states of the currency of energy in the metabolism give an indicator to the cell nucleus. Hey, wait a minute, we're in fasting mode. We need to learn how to burn fat. Well, when you start burning fat, when you start activating those downstream energy carriers, you also start to activate some other things. One thing you deactivate is insulin and IGF, insulin-like growth factor, number one. But here's some of the stress managers. Forkhead Box OS. What is that? FOXO. Peroxisome proliferating activated receptor, PPAR, PPAR gamma, nuclear factor erythroid, NRF or NERF, kinases. You may remember some of the kinases. We mentioned them earlier, AMPK. And the deacetylases, you're not going to remember those. I didn't remember those. But those are the sirtuins. You remember David Sinclair, all about sirtuins, decades of research into sirtuins, looking for a pill of youth. All of these things are stimulated by these lower energy forms, AMPA, NAD+, CoA without the acetyl component. And all of these are stimulated by intermittent fasting. Again, you go beyond that half-day mark and you start oscillating into fat burn, which is what you want. You start to get some of these positive improvements in your metabolism. And as we said, the essence of fat adapted. Now let's look at fat adaptation from a slightly higher level. We were talking about the cells. Now let's talk about the organs themselves. So energy restriction for 10 to 14 hours or more results in depletion of liver glycogen stores, hydrolysis of triglycerides. In other words, now you're starting to break down fats. What do you break the triglycerides into? Free fatty acids in the adipocytes or the fat cells. Free fatty acids released into the circulation are transported into the liver cells where they produce ketone bodies, beta hydroxybutyrate. Those of you who have studied keto diet any at all know exactly what this is. So again, you start making those cellular level changes. Those cellular level changes start creating a difference in what we're burning. We're now burning triglycerides or fats. Those then lead to things like beta hydroxybutyrate. The burning beta hydroxybutyrate again activates transcription factors or the genetics for PPAR alpha, as I said a few minutes ago, ATF4, other stress-related anti-inflammatory hormones. It takes us into a metabolism of autophagy, and again, downregulates insulin and insulin-like growth factor. So again, we're starting to get into mTOR, autophagy, and the basics of fat adaptation. Now, let's look at one other level. This is more of the systems level. You get periods of intermittent fasting, sufficient to cause depletion of liver glycogen stores. They trigger that metabolic switch into fatty acids and ketones. Cells and organ systems adapt to this challenge by activating signaling pathways that bolster mitochondrial function, or that bolster it. You get stress resistance, antioxidation defenses, while upregulating autophagy to remove damaged molecules. During this period of energy restriction, cells adopt a stress resistance mode through reduction in insulin signaling and overall protein synthesis. Exercise, what does that do? It enhances this process. On recovery from fasting, when you eat and sleep, glucose levels increase, ketone levels plummet, cells increase protein synthesis, and you get undergoing growth and repair. Maintenance of intermittent fasting regimens like OMAD, 1 meal a day, or time-restricted eating, TRE, or IF, intermittent fasting, particularly combined with regular exercise, results in many long-term metabolic adaptations. So there you go. That's fat adaptation. And for those of you who didn't make the connection, you get that even with intermittent fasting and clearly other forms of regular fasting. Now, let's go to today's article. It was in the New England Journal, April of this year. Some studies came out of China. The authors randomly, here's what they did. Caloric restriction with or without time-restricted eating in weight loss. So they're just looking at weight loss. They did some brief look at metabolic parameters, but not nearly enough to make a strong statement. Here's what the authors did. They randomly assigned 139 patients with obesity to time-restricted eating, 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. with caloric restriction or daily calorie restriction alone. Well, first of all, those of us who look at this kind of thing would say, that's not much time restriction. That's an 8-hour eating window. Anyhow, you'll see some things that make you go, yeah, okay. For 12 months, the participants followed calorie restriction or caloric restriction diet, 1,500 to 1,800 calories per day for men and 12 to 1,500 for women. And you might also say, dang, that's not much calorie restriction. I would say that too. The primary outcome was change in baseline in body weight. Secondary outcomes included changes in waist circumference, BMI, and again, some very moderate or minimal metabolic bioindicators. 118 participants completed the 12-month follow-up. Mean weight loss for the time restriction group was 8 kilograms. So what are we talking about? Over 20 pounds. For the daily calorie restriction, it was 6 kilograms, so significantly less. There were no significant differences in waist circumference, BMI, body fat, lean mass, blood pressure, and the metabolic risk factors that they looked at. Now, this one was a randomized clinical trial. And here's one of the major concerns I have about that. they're extremely difficult randomized trials for diet. Why is that? Because in order to have a lasting impact, a diet cannot just be a diet. It has to be a permanent change in the way you eat. Food is a personal thing with a lot of habitual behavior, a lot of social behavior, and even addiction. We've talked about it multiple times, especially carb addictions. You don't just randomly assign permanent addictive behavior change. It all boils down to this. Hey, doc, what's the best diet? The one that works for you. Now, what do I recommend? I even recommended Penn's potato diet. Penn Jillette of Penn and Teller. He lost 100 pounds in 84 days. And that's, how could I possibly do that? A lot of people, I know I'm going to get hate comments. Why would you recommend a diet made up entirely of a carb? Here's what happened. And Penn was very clear about it. He said, you get sick of potatoes every day. It's sort of like Dr. Boz's intermittent or fasting using sardines. Sardines and potatoes, the same thing. These mono diets, when you eat food that you just is not that good, you start saying, you lose your food addictions when you restrict what you eat to one thing like that. And for somebody like Penn, but isn't it poison that he's eating if he's clearly probably pre-diabetic or even diabetic at that added 100 pounds? Well, I will tell you this, there is no question. It's like statins. You're taking the poison to fix a problem. Same thing with Penn Jillette. He was taking a poison, the potatoes, to fix the bigger problem, which was his body fat issue. And at the end of the day, the body fat is the bigger risk. I would much have preferred Penn to lose his 100 pounds on a sardine diet, but that's not what he chose. Again, it gets back to, hey, doc, what's the best diet? The one that works for you. I don't fuss much about vegan, vegetarian, keto, carnivore, Whole30, paleo, even the potato diet. What I'm concerned about is this. The biggest dietary mistake is failure to know what you can safely eat. By the time we're 30 years old, half of us start risking damage to our tissues every time we eat carbs. I've covered this in the JAMA Network video, and a UCLA video. Both of the articles on these were really good, and they made the point, the UCLA video. So if you go back, I'll cover those briefly for a second. If you look at the CDC website, they'll say by the time we're age 60, a third of us have prediabetes. That's wrong. It's a lot more than that. UCLA looked at California. JAMA looked at the whole country. And basically what they showed was, it's not by the time we age into 60, it's by the time we're 30 years old. And it's not a third of us have insulin resistance, it's 50%. So again, it brings you to another movie quote, Dirty Harry. 50% of us by the time we're age 30 have prediabetes. Are you feeling lucky? So that's by far the biggest dietary mistake, not knowing that you're poisoning yourself with one of the 3 macronutrients because you haven't had your appropriate testing. There are other poorly recognized things too, like gluten sensitivity, celiac disease. But insulin resistance is Jack the Ripper. It's killing and maiming more of us than anything else. And we know it's out there. We just want to deny it. We don't want it to look. We hide. We hide from the answer. So there we go. Thank you much, and we'll go into Q&A as soon as we get the transition. Start on the Q&A. I got dropped. Technology is a wonderful thing until it doesn't work. So the first thing we had coming out, we had someone asking about lower doses of Crestor. She had said, hey, my doc has me on 20 milligrams of Crestor. I've asked about lower doses. They will not give it to me. And so what's the problem? Is there a risk with lower doses? And I had said, lower doses are all that's needed to decrease cardiovascular inflammation. Most doctors focus on LDL levels as the problem. More often, LDL is basically a bioindicator of cardiovascular inflammation. So the lower doses of statins are all that's needed. The higher doses of Crestor cause more side effects, like increasing insulin resistance. So this person's name was Melissa. Bart's responding, I didn't ask my doctor. I told him to lower my Crestor dose 3 years ago. If he refuses, I'd go to another doctor. And my position is yes. You know, I'm a doc. That's part of what I'm here for. And to me, a doctor's responsibility is not to make decisions for a patient, but to describe for the patient what the facts are, what is known and what isn't known, and to work with the patient to let the patient make their decisions within what's, there's a wide range of what's appropriate in terms of medicine. Dwight Baldwin, let me see if I can expand this on my side a little bit. Dwight Baldwin, how much insulin is needed to lower LP? Niacin is needed to lower Lp(a)? That's a good question. What are the main side effects? Another good question. So most people think, oh, you're not going to get any improvement in Lp(a) unless you go to 2 grams. That's not true. That's just simply not true. I have a ton of patients who've had significant impact, that 30% impact, even with just 250 milligrams. So don't immediately go into the 2 grams, number one. Number two, what are the main side effects? It can cause a temporary increase in insulin resistance, and it can cause inflammation of the liver. So be careful of both of those. And don't just take niacin because you've heard that it's good. I've run into several people doing that. Vape King, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas to you. Desitivity, hello from Georgia. LPG, one of my favorite topics, the super chat button for $10. Thank you so much. Help us get that information out across the world. Vape King, I take kyolic aged garlic extract. It doesn't smell or taste like garlic. It's supposed to help you clear arteries out. I hear aged black garlic's even better. Aged black garlic is more expensive. It's got almost a sweet taste, and I've tried both of them. They're both antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. That's what they are. You know, and I hear that, I see that so many times. I'm not saying that you're doing that, but I see this so many times where people say, you know what, I'm going to take a supplement and that's going to fix my problem. And they never change their diet. They don't even get testing to find out if they're insulin resistant. So it's a great example of, you know what, if you want to get out of a hole, stop digging. So first of all, find out if the carbs that you're eating are safe for you. Probably snake oil. I know kyolic and black garlic are actually, they're real. The data and the evidence are there. But again, the bigger problem is people thinking that that's going to dig them out of a hole, that they're over digging. Again, you cannot supplement your way out of a diet problem. Hey, Doc, what's your opinion on importance of a low omega-6 or omega-3 ratio? I think it's very important. The problem is understanding the lab quality. I don't trust most of the labs that look at omega-3s, but I do take a lot of omega-3s. I take grams of it. I don't take the supplements so much because, in a supplement, you're getting about that much. Whereas you take some salmon, you're getting that much. So consider what you're doing. And if you're going to take it, you do need to get like a gram of EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid. And it's most of the pills that you look at have less than half a gram of EPA. Watchman 82. Hey, Doc, what's your opinion on, I already talked about that. Bart, I take Colic Extra Strength Reserve, 2,400 milligrams per day. I think it has some beneficial effects as an adjunct to statin, per Dr. Matthew. But diet and lifestyle are first, of course. Leo Acapulco, good to hear from you, Leo. Feliz Navidad, Merry Christmas to all the PrevMed family. Greetings, Leo, from Bart. Can pitavastatin be split? I wouldn't try it. I have seen where they make some 1 milligrams. You can get 1 milligram, 2 milligram, and 4 milligram. I would just take the 1 milligram and not take anything lower. We are actually making some changes in our perspective on pitavastatin. We had said at one point that you really couldn't take it every other day. As we go back and reassess the half-life, we think you can. We could probably even take it twice a week, but not once a week like some of the Crestor doses. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we have some content on it. Rebecca Greenwell, a super sticker for $9.99 to help us get that content out there. Thank you so much, Rebecca, smiling in that picture. Harvey Ops, regarding the cold potato acts as resistant starch, what would make the difference regarding insulin impact? Or would that make a difference? You bring up a great point, Harvey. When you start actually looking at those, yes, there is some reality to resistant starches. So for example, cooking these potatoes and then refrigerating them. However, be very careful and don't rely on that, because when you actually look at the studies, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So hopefully Penn was doing some resistant starch potatoes, but again, I'm skeptical of resistant starch, of depending on resistant starches. If you look at the evidence, I think you'll share my skepticism. None of your business. How do you feel about the 5-to-1 rule, where you divide the carbs by the fiber, and if it has 5 or less, is that good? Well, I've never heard that rule. I will say this, the more fiber you can get, see, in case you don't know it, and a lot of people don't, fiber is legally, the FDA requires that we call fiber a carb. So when you look on food labels, you'll see a lot of carbs that are actually just fiber labeled as carbs. And then you think, oh, no, I can't have that. Well, for example, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, those little spears, asparagus spears, all these things would be labeled as pure, almost pure carbs. And you can eat all of those that you want, because the specific carb that they are is fiber. And fiber is not glycemic. So what we're talking about whenever we talk about carbs is not just all carbs as labeled by the FDA. We're talking about glycemic carbs. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Now, is there a 5-to-1 rule? Yeah, I mean, if you're getting like 5-to-1, if when you break down your carbs, 5 of those carbs are fiber for every 1, that's not a bad deal. That's, that's going to be relative. That's clearly going to be healthier than glycemic carbs, pure glycemic carbs. And what are the options for someone who cannot take statins and cannot afford Repatha? Well, even if you can take statins, even if you can afford Repatha, the number one option is, as usual, taking diet. Now, I will tell you, I've had, obviously, it may or may not be obvious. I use a lot of statins, very low dose. I use them very differently and a lot less than other docs who do what I do. The point that I'm bringing up, though, is that I get very little statin intolerance. It's when you're taking these large doses, like, Crestor 20 and Crestor 40 and Lipitor 80, that you really start running into problems. These very low doses, I've adjusted doses lower and lower. I've had some people on 2.5 milligrams of Crestor once a week, and I just have not had people have those reactions to it. So I think you need to define what you mean by cannot take statins. Now, I will also say there are plenty of people, I've got plenty of people. At one time, over half of my patients that could have benefited from it did not want to take them. And that's fine too. They understand. Like I said earlier on, my role was to not force them to let me make their decisions for them. My role as a doctor is to give them the facts and let them make their decisions. Given what I do for a living, you probably wouldn't be surprised that a lot of my folks are statin haters and don't want to take a statin. I would guess it's a much lower ratio. About 5 years ago, over half of my folks that I thought statins would help for just didn't want to. At this point, it's a much lower level, maybe 10%. Kathy Ridgway, now low is low. Did you mean how low is low? And what would be a high dose of Crestor? Okay, so 5 milligrams per day or less is a low dose of Crestor. 10 milligrams per day or higher is a high dose of Crestor. And as I said before, I've had multiple, I routinely have people on 5 milligrams of Crestor every other day, 2.5 every, twice a week, and even 2.5 once a week. So we're talking, those are low doses, Kathy. The other thing I would say is that the other statin that I use is pitavastatin, which is a very good low dose statin. It does not impact insulin resistance like the others. And the low doses of Crestor don't either. We used to use a good bit of simvastatin and brevastatin that was because Crestor was expensive then, like Livalo is expensive now. When 3 years after Crestor lost its patent, it became a commodity, and then there was no need to use simvastatin or preventative low dose. Alan Turner, there appears to be an increasing trend towards recommending elimination of wheat and grains, especially grains. Is that important for secondary cardiovascular disease prevention? Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So one of the places where you'll hear that is gluten. That's a fad off and on for over a decade. I'm on people to say they're on a gluten-free diet. I actually am glad to hear that, and am glad to see that trend. And here's why. Most grains have glutens, especially most grains in the standard American diet. Excuse me just a minute. Will, I'm giving the YouTube show. Can I call you back in about half an hour? Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Pardon that. So the standard American diet has a lot of grains in it. And the problem with grains is that they are a bigger source of carbs than than anything else, including sugars. You talk about people being on you know, I need to cut the carbs. That means I need to decrease my sugars. No, you don't. You need to decrease your grains. Yes, cutting sugars helps, but no, grains are usually a far bigger source of carbs in the standard American diet. Most American diets, most global diets, grains are a bigger source of carbs. Um, so, yes, I'm very excited to see this decreased use of grains. The other thing, and you hear people like William Davis, Sweet Belly, one of the things they talk about is as the grains have been manipulated, using ANOVA, analysis of variance, to get better and better, quote, better and better grains. You're getting more and more gluten in them. You're getting more and more carbs in those grains. And that makes them better for being more dense for an energy source. But again, that's the problem, the density of the carbs in an energy source. You go back to what we covered in the show today, the content, and that's the opposite of what we need. Desitivity, Doc, in your experience, is it good related to carb intake, and is it more due to fructose, sucrose, or glucose? Oh, is gout related to carb intake? Desitivity, that's a great question. If you read, what is the guy's name? Dropping Acid. And somebody looked that up for us. Dropping Acid. I know the guy's name. He did some of the other. He's done some really, really good work and tells a great story. And his point is, look, carbs are really more of a driver of gout than anything else. And I would agree with him. Go back, take a look at look it up on YouTube if you're a YouTube watcher. Get the book if you're a big book reader, Dropping Acid. And somebody, again, help me remember the name of that author. He's not entirely 100% accurate, and sometimes it gets a little bit academic sounding, but the concept is very appropriate. We've known that for a while. If your old country doc knows that most gout attacks are going to happen in the holiday period, especially in the old days when you didn't get that much access to things like tangerines and oranges. People would get crates of oranges and they would eat a lot of oranges. That fructose would cause that gout attack. Now, does that mean that fructose is a bigger issue? It's a 5-carbon glucose, so it's similar to the biochemistry. It's a 5-carbon ring that gout is associated with. But the reality is, this is a much, much bigger issue, and carbs in general are a big issue, the big issue for gout. Ricky the Gun 1. I've recently found a local doctor who follows the Baldonine method. How would you say that your approach differs from Baldonine and another plan that I've used, the Zone diet? I studied the Zone at one point, and there were similarities. Baldonine, I've done a lot of work with Brad Bale. He and I used to be in the same practice. Worked with Amy. I've learned a lot from them. I would hope they would say they've learned some from me. I think one of the key items is that I dig deeper in terms of insulin resistance. I look for insulin resistance from the very beginning. Brad and Amy have tended in the past to say, we're looking at cardiovascular inflammation. That's the problem. Insulin resistance, diabetes, prediabetes tended to be a little bit more of an afterthought, even though if you look in their book, I did this once as an exercise. I went back. I noticed Brad and Amy had insulin resistance sort of buried in the book. And I found it about 4 or 5 times where they actually said they thought about 80% of this problem was insulin resistance. I would say more like 85 or 90. And again, because it's such a core part of the problem, I focus immediately on that as opposed to going back and uh, looking at all the other different types of inflammation. Um, I think those are some of the key differences. I hope that helps Ricky. Bottom line, if you're getting some care with anybody that's Beldenine trained, you're still getting a lot closer to the problem than you do with your standard doctor. Belmont Western, $10 for a super chat. Thank you again so much for helping us get this word out there. And Gilbert is showing you how to do that super chat. Thank you, Gilbert. If vitamin K2 can reduce calcification, would it make sense to avoid it when there is evidence of soft plaque and CIMT, and we're trying to get that to calcify? No, calcification is not an independent process that's dependent on calcium. Calcification happens when you get decreased inflammation, and usually because of the decreased driver of insulin resistance. So you're majoring on the minors if you're trying to look at calcium levels and all that stuff. Go back and focus on the root cause, which again, as I just said a minute ago at the last discussion, 90% of it's going to be insulin resistance. Harvey Ops, 500 milligrams of niacin, lowered LP(a), LDL, and particles, no impact on liver enzymes. Doctor's Best niacin with NiExtend buffer from Endurance Products. Maybe an unabashed plug for Endurance Products. I used to use one of two types. Some people just use normal, regular, unadulterated niacin, but I tried that early on and it felt like I was literally being scalped. I mean, you get these niacin flushes that are crazy. And some people like them, I don't. I used one of two, Rugby brand, like the game, RUGBY, and Enduracin. And Amy, the NP working with me at that time, said, look, I've continued to work with patients and it's doing better. They tolerate them better. Melissa, what's your thoughts on Cosentyx? I'm concerned about taking because of my immune system suppression. I'm not familiar with Cosentyx and it affecting my mitochondria. I have severe osteo and have been prescribed this medication. Sorry, Melissa, not going to be able to help there. Hi, Bart from Leo. William Brewster, hi, Doc. After our discussion on my CIMT results, I then discussed same with my cardio doc to see if he had anything to say. He did not and said it wouldn't change what he does. Continuing. We get that a lot. Kathy Ridgway, thank you, Kathy. I did mean hello, but it was not able to edit. William Brewster, I'll be subscribing to your monthly program today. Thank you, William. I appreciate that. Any way to more easily measure carb count, including glycemic count? No, you bring up a good point, William. So here's the thing. There are some software programs that I have several different patients decide to use. Some of them like them. I tend to be old-fashioned and somewhat. So, my mom was asking yesterday, we were talking about carbs, and she asked about tomatoes. I went to Google and I said, okay, how many carbs in a typical medium-sized tomato? And it was about 4.8. So I look it up and learn. And here's what I recommend that people do. Go through the painful exercise, the detailed exercise of actually counting the carbs in the food that you eat for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That 2 weeks of, 15 to 30 added minutes per day of looking up everything that you eat is going to put you in a great place. And here's why. Most of us have maybe 3 different breakfast choices. Once we understand the carbs in those breakfast choices, we know what's there. Same thing with lunch and dinner, except maybe 5 to 8 different breakfast choices. Lunch and dinner choices. And once you understand the carbs that are in those meals, then you tend to repeat. So then within that 2 week period, you start to get an understanding of how many carbs per day you're eating. You will use that forever. At that point, relax. Well, make sure that you get to 100 grams of carbs or less per day. And then just relax a little bit and wait for a few weeks, a month or two, and say, okay, this is the lowest hanging fruit. Maybe you're eating sandwiches on 3 or 4 days a week for lunch, and figure out, okay, can I do it as a ham and cheese roll up without the bread, or can I get some keto bread? Either one of them, decreasing the amount or substituting. Either of those are great options. And at that point, now you have decreased 50 grams of carbs, 40 or 50 grams of carbs with that one substitution or change. Then stabilize on that. Within a few months, you'll find that you're at 50 grams or less of carbs, and you don't feel like you're sacrificing or giving up. So that's what I recommend. Tricia Grant, what's the difference between niacin and niacinamide? Niacinamide is a related item. For example, NR, niacinamide riboside, was it's considered to be a low flush niacin supplement, and a lot of people, because it's a supplement, think it's great. I think we reported that. If we haven't reported it, we will soon when Jesus gets to the content. There's been some articles coming out recently that NR, niacinamide riboside, actually was a risk factor in terms of, I believe it was breast cancer. The cancer cells used that supplement to grow faster. So again, you make the assumption that supplements are going to A, cure your problem, and B, be harmless. And both of those assumptions are big assumptions. They need to be reconsidered. Harvey Ops, Perlmutter, that's correct. Thank you so much, Harvey. Perlmutter wrote the book, Dropping Acid. He's got a couple of videos out on it, and I think, again, great interest. Again, he overstates the facts sometimes because he writes whole books on a single concept, but it's worthwhile and a very, very good book. David Perlmutter. Thanks, folks. Shark Air, fasting glucose 99, current glucose 98. Looks like I can just cruise through the day. A lot of people get fasting glucose 90, and so therefore they get labeled as, I've got no problems. You do not have diabetes. Until they do a glucose challenge and they take, 75 or 100 grams of glucose, and all of a sudden their glucose goes up to 300, and it turns out that they are actually full-blown diabetic and just didn't know it. So don't rely on fasting glucose, Shark Air. Desitivity, Perlmutter is the author. David Perlmutter. Thank you, folks. We got it now. Desitivity, any thoughts on creating a network of docs that will follow your methodology? That's exactly what we're doing. If you go back to the go back to the first 5 minutes of this show today, and you'll see where we're talking about doing exactly that. So yes, some of us could benefit if the docs were trained by you and found to be recommended by you. Exactly right. That's exactly what we're looking at. That would be great for sure. And that's what we're looking at. Check out our new, speaking of which, thank you so much, Gilbert. Check out our new Physicians Network channel. Invite your doc. https://www.youtube.com channel. That's our Doctors Network channel. Low-dose John Kusaba, low-dose rosuvastatin. I've got a meeting. Hold on just a minute. Let me check on the time here. Yep. John Kusaba, low-dose rosuvastatin, 5 milligrams if you have plaque. All blood work good. Yes. If you have plaque, it's clear that you have developed cardiovascular inflammation and you're capable of doing that. And you don't feel it when plaque happens. So that I would recommend considering two things. Number one, baby aspirin. And number two, low-dose statin if you have cardiovascular plaque. Oren Halperin, hi, I've been on CR for 2 years. Oh, caloric restriction. Everybody uses these acronyms. And anyway, so 1,950 calories a day. Recently having challenges in eating 3,000 per day. Tips for sticking to diet. Well, one of the questions is, are you eating carbs? Because when you're eating carbs, your blood sugar goes up and down. And when it goes down, that's when you get hungry. Bart Robinson, I subscribe to your other channel. Oh, thank you, Bart. I appreciate that. Subscribe to the other channel. And again, hopefully, well, we should be, we had some internal miscommunication. I recorded about 24 videos for that channel way over a month ago now. And they were waiting on us for titles. We were waiting on them to get it set up. I think we're there now. We're starting to get those videos populated. And again, as you'll see, they're for your doc, to help your doc understand what he or she should be doing to get into prevention and making a difference, fee for value, in their patient's health. Geraldine Bondak. Hi, Doc, from the Philippines. Good to hear from you. Does CoQ10 help get a healthy heart? Most of us recommend CoQ10, especially for anybody that's taking a statin. Now, I did a video on just how could you tell whether it's working or not. And the bottom line is you can't. It's one of those supplements that you have to say, you know, we know there's little to no harm associated with it. And it makes sense, but again, you can't measure it. We are going to be having to wrap up. D. Dutton, last comment for the day, last question. Wishing everyone involved in your production or viewership a healthy new year. Thank you so much, D. Dutton. I appreciate that very much. And same here. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. Okay, we're out.